Including information from outside sources in your research paper is essential to the writing process, but in order to have your reader believe what you are saying and be ready to trust the information that you're presenting, you need to build credibility for the sources you provide. So when you are presenting this information for your citation, you might want to give background on who wrote it or published it, when it was first published. For example, if it was recently done for a new scientific article, that means that it's probably the cutting edge of scientific investigation. Or if it was written 100 years ago and you are talking about what people thought during that time period, it shows that it's relevant for that historical context. You might also want to give an overview of how the study or experiment was conducted if you're talking about a scientific journal describing that experiment. You always want to describe what type of source it is and any information about the author that would help the reader to trust and understand why you're using that person's information. So in order to describe and introduce the quotation or the paraphrase that you are citing in your paper, you need to use signal phrases and transitional phrases to help the reader understand basically the transition or the move from your own words to someone else's words. This method also allows you to introduce all of the information that we've already talked about on the previous slide in a very efficient and concise way, so you're not adding too much explanation within your paper. So let's look at the example. We have researchers at BMC Public Health find that women separated from family members following an earthquake had an increased risk of depression and anxiety, suggesting that family ties and responsibility are a factor in development of anxiety. So if we look at the color coding, we can see that we have the source, the connecting phrase, what did they do? What did they do? They found that. And then we include our quotation in green. And then here's an optional phrase at the back of the sentence in orange that explains why we are talking about it or why we are using it. You'll also notice within the example sentence, the citation. This tells us where we can find it from our bibliography at the end of the paper and clearly shows that the quote we're using is not from the writer, but from a source that the writer used when writing the paper. So on the previous slide, we had the example finds that as a signal phrase, but here are some others that you may use in a different situation. If you want to use the words explains, asserts, suggests, concludes, or saying according to source, these are all different ideas that you can use to signal that the citation will be included in this sentence. So there are two different ways that you can include information from your cited sources within your research paper. The first is quotations, direct copying of a source word for word. They must always include quotation marks and appear exactly as they did in the original source in your paper, so you should not change anything within the quote. Another way that you can include information in your paper is a paraphrase, which is when you restate the information in your own words. So how do we know when to use a quotation and when to use a paraphrase? Use a quotation when you want to establish the credibility of an author, i.e. you want to show that they are good at what they do, their information can be trusted. You might also want to use a quotation if you think that what they say, the knowledge of their statement, will really strongly support your opinion or your stance. A final reason why you might want to use a quote is to compare and contrast topics to provide evidence. So if one person is quoted as saying something that another person is quoted as saying completely different, you can show the gap or the distance between these two opinions of, for example, two highly respected scientists that don't see the same way about a topic. Within your paper, your thesis, your argument, your organization are the strongest things that you need to include. Those are the foundations and the structure of the bridge. but your bridge needs to have some additional support. And so while you cannot write a paper based only on your own thoughts, you also cannot write a paper only with the quotes of other people. You have to use these quotes as a supplementary to your own argument to support your overall stance or define something specific to the topic. Here's a quick explanation of how to put quotations as part of a sentence, especially when the quote is a little bit long and you want to only put parts of it. See below, Angela Davis wrote in her book, Women, Race, and Class. We see this green box that's highlighting 3 dots or ellipses, ... sexual inequality as we know it today, etc. This is a way to cut off the previous part of the sentence so that you don't have to worry about changing the quote to misrepresent what Angela Davis is saying, but you also are able to edit it down to only the part that you want to include in your sentence to make sure it's not too long or too difficult for the reader to understand. If you want to include a quote as a part of a sentence, but you find that the grammar doesn't make sense when you include it in your own sentence, you can change the quotation, but you have to show to the reader that how you're changing it is not how it was in the original source. So, for example, if the article states, "We discovered that such and such happened," but you want to write it as "They discovered that such and such happened," the way that you can show that you are still quoting it accurately, but you are making it grammatically correct for your own paper, is that you put the word that you want to replace "we" with those brackets. So, quotation mark, bracket, "they," end bracket, "discovered that," etc. All of us have written a paper that we just felt we did not have enough information or words to get the word count that the professor was asking for. But I am here to caution you, please do not use quotes to reach your word counts unless you are able to analyze and explain why the quote is there. So if you are unable to explain the quote and it is not relevant to the argument of your thesis, please do not include it. You need to be able to expand on your quotes every time you use them and prove to the reader why they are relevant to the topic. The second way of including information from an outside source in your research paper is paraphrasing. When you make a paraphrase, you are changing and rewriting the information from the original source into your own words. So you're avoiding plagiarism, but you're also proving to the reader that you understand the original source because you're able to present it in your own way. So when you are trying to explain something or make it more clear, when you are giving a brief explanation of a very long work, or if you think that your paper has too many quotes already and you just need to write in your own words for all the other information you need to provide, these are all great times to paraphrase. When you're writing your paper, you will often find that you will need to summarize while you are paraphrasing. And so this should sum up or give the main points very concisely in order that they understand the entire idea with as few words as possible. So when you're trying to provide an overview or introduction of the topic, and when you're trying to provide more context or information about the topic that would otherwise take way too long to explain in the most full sense, this is a summary. When you're writing your paper and you are deciding what quotes or paraphrases to include in it, you need to be always looking back to your thesis and each of the main points of your thesis or the subclaims in order to decide, does this quote or this piece of information that I will paraphrase actually apply to my argument and make it stronger? So you can think, how does it benefit the main idea of this paragraph? Or how does it support the stance as a whole? Within each body paragraph of your thesis, They should, each of them, relate to one main point of the thesis. So looking at your topic sentence of the body paragraph and how it concludes at the end of that paragraph, it should all point back to one discernible or one easily definable subclaim of your thesis. It should not be too subtle or vague. So if the reader cannot immediately understand why you're including it, you need to make sure that you are connecting those dots for the reader so that instead of them becoming confused or feeling like they're getting lost within the argument, everything is extremely easy to understand. As you gain experience writing research papers for your classes, you might begin to see how different ideas that you are presenting with in a paper could really be connected together to form a stronger, more overarching idea. This is called a synthesis. And if you are synthesizing information together from multiple sources, this is one of the things that you can pat yourself on the back for, because it's a very difficult and highly advanced skill that you can learn as a writer. While we don't have time to explain exactly how to do this, basically synthesis is building up a larger idea of your paper from multiple sources, while analysis is breaking down and explaining in detail a few main sources at their simplest parts. In order to write a paper that synthesizes ideas, you need to be able to analyze, but synthesis takes it a step further, providing a very strong argument based off of the implications of two or more sources. When you're writing your research paper, please be sure to know which style of citation you need to be using. MLA and APA are two common styles that undergrad students often will write in based on the recommendation or requirement of their professors, but they're very different styles. MLA is mostly for the humanities, and APA style is used mostly for the social sciences, which includes psychology, but also things like education, economics, nursing, and maybe even sociology, depending on where you're studying it. MLA in-text citations require the author name and page number, if there is one, with no punctuation within the parentheses, whereas APA in-text citations require author, year, and page number separated by commas within the parentheses. And if you're including page numbers, you should have P period or PP period to show a singular page or a range of pages. Many students become anxious when they are trying to figure out where to put the in-text citation within their sentences or their paragraphs. When you use direct quotes, please put the citation as close to the quote as possible, outside of the quotation mark but before the period. Because it's a direct quote, we need to know as soon as possible when we are reading it where it came from. We don't want to have the reader wondering, where did this quote come from and why is it in here? So put it immediately after the quotation mark and then the period after the citation. When you paraphrase, you can include the citation for each general idea at the end of that sentence. And if you are just describing, summarizing, or explaining one source in an entire paragraph, you can actually cite all of those ideas from that same source once at the end of the paragraph. If you switch from one source to another within a sentence or a paragraph, you need to make sure that each one is clearly marked by your citation and where it came from. So, for example, if you are quoting something from a Dr. Anderson in their first sentence, and then the next sentence talks about Dr. Wilson, but then the sentence after that is also Dr. Anderson, you need to cite every single one of those sentences separately. Anderson, Wilson, Anderson. This is to make sure the reader doesn't get confused and that you are not accused of plagiarism in your paper. I hope this presentation has been helpful. If you need any more help with your research papers, welcome to the ARC. We will be glad to help you more.